Have you ever been humiliated in such a painful moment that even today, the mere thought of it makes your chest ache as if it were happening all over again? On the day of my husband's wake, when I just wanted the right to say a final goodbye, they looked at me and said, laughing, "You won't be able to handle it." Those words pierced my heart like knives. I didn't know whether to cry for the death of the man who had been by my side my entire life, or for the cruelty of those who denied me the dignity of being with him until the end. I took a deep breath, raised my chin, and went in anyway, but nothing could erase the pain of the public humiliation I suffered at that moment. My name is Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and I've spent my entire life believing that respect for the elderly was an unquestionable value within the family. After all, we built our homes, carried our children in our arms, and gave up our dreams so many times so they could achieve theirs. But on the day I needed them most, they treated me like a burden, like someone too weak to bear the family's grief. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt the contempt of those who should be supporting you precisely when you feel most vulnerable? At that wake, I felt the same sensation so many women my age have told me, that of being invisible, as if my voice had ceased to exist, as if I no longer had the right to decide about my own life, not even about saying goodbye to the man with whom I had built half a century of stories. I stood before that closed door, hearing muffled laughter, and realized that the greatest burden was not my husband's death, but the injustice of being treated like an incapable child. And what cut me most was the certainty that they believed they were right, that they truly could make decisions for me. With each passing second, the humiliation deepened. It was as if they were ripping from me not only the right to say goodbye, but also my very identity. That final, denied goodbye wasn't just a stolen moment. It was an attempt to erase a lifetime of struggle, love, and silent sacrifice. It was in that moment that I understood the power of silent revenge, not the kind of revenge of screams or scandals, but the kind born when the soul refuses to accept injustice. And I wonder, how often are the elderly silenced like this? How often are they denied the chance to say goodbye, to choose, to speak? The law of return exists, and sooner or later, every gesture of contempt returns with a vengeance. But at that moment, all I felt was a crushed heart. Loneliness enveloping me like a heavy cloak, and my husband's voice echoing within me as if to say, "Don't let them silence your goodbye." Perhaps that's why every step I took toward that coffin became an act of courage. It wasn't just about me, it was about all the women who have been treated as fragile when, in fact, they carry within themselves a strength no one can imagine. Dignity in old age isn't a favor, it's a right. And in that room, amidst the scornful looks and cruel words, I decided I wouldn't leave silent. This is the memory that remains with me to this day, marked by shock, pain, and shame. But it's also the point where something inside me awakened, because when a goodbye is stolen, something greater is born in the heart of the one who refuses to be erased. And it was exactly at that moment, faced with the forced silence and cruel humiliation, that something unexpected happened. And you know what hurts me most when I remember that day? It's that feeling of being silenced wasn't just mine. I often wonder how many other people have had their voices stolen, how many fathers, mothers, and grandparents were silenced precisely when they most needed to be heard. That's why I want to ask you something. If at any point in this story you also felt revolt, if you've been through something similar, or if you were simply outraged by what happened to me, leave here in the comments what touched you most. I read every word, and your experience can welcome and give strength to others who also carried this same burden. And if this story has already made you reflect, I invite you to leave a like. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's through this that YouTube understands that this message needs to reach more people who may be living in silence today with the same pain I experienced. And if you believe that stories like this cannot be forgotten, that we need to talk about respect for the elderly, dignity in grief, and the power of life's justice, then subscribe to the channel. It's your presence here that keeps this space alive, that gives me reasons to continue bringing real stories capable of awakening something within us, because deep down, this isn't just my story, it reflects so many others that deserve to be heard. And that's exactly why, even hurt, even humiliated, I kept going. My name is Maggie Carter. I'm 72 years old, and all my life, I've worked as a seamstress. My days were guided by small rituals that seemed unimportant to the world, but to me, meant everything. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the gentle sound of the kettle as it began to boil, the feeling of John holding my hand when we went to church on Sundays. These details, which to many might seem routine, were the foundation of my existence. I believed that true happiness lay in simplicity, in the constancy of choosing each day. John was always my safe haven. While I spent hours at the sewing machine, altering dresses, altering pants, or transforming scraps of fabric into something new, he took care of the house and, most importantly, of me. I never needed grand trips or luxuries to feel like I was living a rich life. What we had was respect, affection, and a silent complicity that only those who have shared decades of life can understand. Perhaps that's why the pain of loss was so unbearable, because when you build your entire story around someone, there's no sufficient preparation for the moment when that person is gone. I can still close my eyes and hear the sound of his footsteps coming through the door, or the clink of the cup he placed on the table as he called me to rest a little. Routine has become my most vivid emotional memory. And it's precisely this contrast between before and after that makes absence hurt so much. Waiting for a phone call that never comes, staring at the empty chair in the kitchen, feeling the space beside the bed grow cold in the wee hours. Every little detail becomes a cruel reminder that life has changed, and changed without my permission. Many talk about grief as if it were merely sadness, but for me it was also humiliation and injustice. Because they didn't let me experience the process of saying goodbye with dignity. I, who had been a faithful companion until the end, was treated as if I were too fragile to bear the hidden truth of goodbye. And that, for me, was more painful than the silence of the house without him. How can one decide for another what pain they can or cannot bear? This question haunts me to this day. Sewing has always been more than just work. It was also my way of organizing thoughts, of transforming chaos into something meaningful. And, in the midst of mourning, I realized that my own life needed this same transformation. Not a transformation of clothes or fabrics, but an internal shift, a new mindset to bear the weight of absence. I learned that mourning isn't just crying, it's also a decision to carry on, to rise, to not fade away, even when the world insists on pushing you into the shadows. The hardest part was facing the behind the scenes of my own family. The mocking laughter, the feeling that I was treated like a decoration, not someone with a voice. This kind of humiliation leaves a deeper impression than you might imagine. You believe you're surrounded by people who should support you, but you discover that, at your most fragile moment, they reveal another side. This is where the painful revelation comes. Blood doesn't always guarantee respect. It was at that moment that I realized my journey wasn't just about the loss of John, but also about the impact of feeling invisible to those who were supposed to protect me. Many people think of grief as just silence and tears, but there's also a hidden struggle within it, a struggle against loneliness, against injustice, against the feeling that your story could be erased. And every time I remembered the smell of coffee, the needle gliding through the fabric, or John's hand holding mine, that memory became not only longing but also strength. Because each memory was proof that I had lived something true, something no one could take away from me. Maybe that's why, even though I was broken inside, I refused to be left out. Because it wasn't just saying goodbye to a husband, it was saying goodbye to a life built with dignity. And denying that was the same as denying my own existence. I knew I needed to lift my head and walk, no matter how much it hurt, because there is a moment when pain turns into courage. And it was exactly at that point that everything began to change. After John's departure, it felt like everything around me had been ripped away from me all at once. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the pain of loss wouldn't come alone. Ethan and Vanessa, my son and daughter-in-law, took charge of every detail as if I no longer had a voice. Documents disappeared from my hands, decisions were made without my consultation, and suddenly I was just a spectator in my own story. They told me it was for my own good, that it meant I wouldn't have to worry. But with every sentence, every gesture, I felt like they weren't protecting me. They were pushing me away. I heard phrases like, "You don't need to worry about this," or "We'll take care of everything." But caring, in that context, meant reducing me to someone incapable. This was the first hidden truth I had to face. Caring can be a disguise for control, and when control sets in, the feeling is one of isolation. I felt like my home was no longer mine, that my presence was disturbing. Even the simplest conversations were muffled, as if my opinion were just a lost echo. I began to experience a painful contrast While I remembered John's complicity, the respect he always gave me in every decision, I now found myself treated as someone who should silently accept what was imposed. This sudden transformation in the family dynamic left me paralyzed. I, who had always been consulted on everything, now had to ask permission even to know the time of the wake. Imagine the impact this had on someone who always believed that family was synonymous with unity and respect. Behind the scenes, I noticed small signs of devaluation. Exchanging glances, whispers when I entered the room, changes in plans without anyone warning me. It was as if I had become a burden, someone who needed to be spared, but in reality, I was being discarded. This initial isolation was crueler than any mocking words, because it wasn't just about being silenced, it was about being erased little by little, until I believed I truly no longer mattered. It's painful when you realize your own voice no longer echoes within your family, when every decision is made without you, when your memories, your history, and even your pain are pushed aside. I swallowed hard every time I heard, "It's better this way, Mom." It was like a child who didn't understand anything going on around her, but inside me, something screamed. I knew there was a huge difference between being cared for and being silenced, and with each passing day, this discomfort grew. I began to realize there was an invisible agenda in their actions, a hidden truth that wasn't spoken aloud. It was as if there was a pre-written script in which my role was simply to obey, accept, and shut up. But deep inside me, the memory of who I was before, the memory of the life I'd built with John, reminded me that I couldn't simply disappear. This journey of forced silence led me to reflect on mindset and choices. Would I allow my story to end like this, erased amid decisions that weren't mine? Or would I be able to reclaim my dignity and show that, even in grief, I still had the strength to choose my own path? These questions became part of my daily routine, as if every gesture of devaluation were also a wake-up call. And it was precisely in this shadowy environment, where protection was just a facade and isolation became routine, that something inside me began to change. Because there are moments in life when the weight of silence is so great that it transforms into courage. The courage to look into the eyes of those who try to silence you. The courage to face even those closest to you. The courage to stand up when they expect you to bow down. And, in the midst of this emptiness, I sensed something greater was about to happen. I didn't yet know exactly how I would react, but something inside me was already preparing for the revelation to come. On the day of the wake, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest, as if something was out of place. I put on my blue dress, the one John always said matched my eyes, and calmly fixed my hair. I knew it would be one of the hardest days of my life, but I also knew I needed to be strong. Not for others, but for myself and for his memory. As I put on my shoes, I took a deep breath and whispered, "Today I'm coming to you, John, and no one will stop me." I believed this until I heard the first words that would change everything. Vanessa looked me up and down, and with a smile laden with irony, said, "You won't be able to handle it." It wasn't advice. It wasn't care. It was mockery. A sentence spoken as if my pain were a spectacle, as if my fragility were a reason to laugh at me. And there, faced with that sentence, I felt something inside me break. The grief, already heavy, mixed with the humiliation of being treated as someone incapable of handling her own life. Have you ever felt that kind of blow, when, in addition to the loss, they also try to steal your dignity? It's like they've ripped the same person from you twice. The following hours were a maze of closed doors. I discovered they'd created a family group on my phone and excluded me from it. Messages about the wake, the times, the details, everything circulated among them, but never reached me. When I asked, they fell silent or changed the subject. When I insisted, they told me I didn't need to know anything, that the important thing was to rest. It was as if my own story were unfolding behind the scenes, where I no longer had access, as if the hidden truth had been locked away in a place I could never enter. I went to the chapel at what I thought was the right time, but when I arrived, the hall was still empty. I sat alone, staring at the lined pews, and the silence seemed to mock my presence. I later discovered they had changed the time on purpose, so I wouldn't be there from the beginning. Can you imagine the impact of that? Losing not only your husband but also the right to decide when and how to say goodbye to him. The isolation, in that moment, wasn't just physical. It was an open wound in the soul. And yet, I stayed. Because, There was something inside me that refused to let go. I clutched my bag tightly in my lap, my hands sweating and shaking, but my feet were firmly planted on the ground. My heart, locked in pain, pounded, as if screaming that this goodbye was rightfully mine. And as I waited, I remembered the many times John had held my hand in the darkest moments, telling me I was stronger than I believed. Those memories were what kept me going, even when everything around me told me to give up. When the first guests finally began to arrive, I noticed the sidelong glances, the whispered whispers. Some hugged me, but others looked away, as if I were an intruder in my own husband's life. It's cruel when your vulnerability is exposed in front of everyone, when what should have been a collective embrace of support turns into silent judgment. I felt alone, even surrounded by people. It was like being in the middle of a crowd, and yet hearing only the echo of your own silence. There was a moment when I considered leaving. The weight was too great, and the feeling of being unwelcome crushed me. But there was also a small flame inside me, a voice that said, "Don't leave, you have a right to be here." And it was that voice that held me, that kept me sitting on the same bench. Even when the laughter behind me sounded like knives, every minute that passed showed me how much grief can reveal hidden truths about people. Those I thought would be by my side walked away, and those I least expected were the ones who offered me a sincere look of compassion. It was in this contrast that I realized that grief isn't just about losing those we love, but also about discovering who we truly are. When everything falls apart, the journey of saying goodbye to John was being shaped by decisions that weren't mine, but the decision to stay was, and it was in that heavy silence, between piercing gazes and closing doors, that something began to grow inside me. Because there are pains that crush us, but there are also pains that awaken. And, even wounded, I knew that wouldn't be the last time they would try to silence me. What I didn't yet know was how, amidst the humiliation and isolation, I would find a strength I never imagined I had. I found the letter on a quiet afternoon, when the house seemed larger than it actually was, every corner echoing the emptiness of John's absence. His Bible lay on the table, open to Psalms, as always, but there was something between the pages, a yellowed envelope, with the handwriting I knew better than any other. My hands trembled as I opened it, and there was his voice, reaching me like an eternal whisper, reaching through time. "Maggie, promise me you'll hold my hand during our final goodbyes. It's up to you." I read and reread those words so many times. They seemed engraved on my skin. A hidden truth, guarded by him like a secret pact, was now emerging. John, even ill, had sensed what might happen. He knew they might try to push me away, silence my presence, deny me my dignity, and yet, he trusted me. It was as if that letter were a key to unlock the door Ethan and Vanessa had locked on my life. At that moment, memories washed over me like strong waves, hard to contain. I saw again the scene of our wedding, the simple dress I'd sewn myself from cheap fabrics, but sewn with love. I heard the church bells, felt his hand, firm and warm, squeezing mine as if swearing more than fidelity, as if surrendering his very soul. I remembered the sleepless nights when his cough kept him awake, and I spent hours making tea, praying quietly that his body would endure another day. I remembered the sound of the sewing machines that accompanied me into the early hours of the morning, every stitch I made to secure the money for the medicine that kept John alive. None of this was seen. None of this was remembered by those who now felt entitled to decide what I should feel, where I could be, how I should grieve. I held the letter to my chest, and I felt something different. It wasn't just longing, it was transformation. That revelation reassured me that I wasn't alone, that John was still with me, guiding me even from the other side. He had purposely left a kind of emotional map so I wouldn't get lost in the darkness they tried to impose on me. And rereading those words, I realized it wasn't just a request. It was a loving command, a silent summons for me not to bow to injustice. I took the letter, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my dress pocket. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was my strength, my invisible shield against the isolation they tried to impose on me. From then on, my every step would carry the memory of the sacrifice we'd made together. And every decision would be guided by the promise I'd just silently renewed, that as I walked to the chapel, memories and feelings mingled in an almost unbearable confusion. I thought of all the times I'd kept quiet to keep the peace in the family, all the times I'd accepted being left out to avoid causing friction. Now I realized how much that silence had cost me, and at the same time, I understood that fate was offering me the chance to rewrite that story. The closed doors that had left me outside were no longer the end. They were merely an obstacle, because with that letter in my pocket, I also carried John's voice, the weight of our years together, and the strength of something no one could erase. It was as if, suddenly, I saw behind the scenes of everything that had happened, as if a light had revealed what had always been hidden. I was never weak, never alone, never invisible. And with that thought, I lifted my head, held tight to the memory of him, and walked toward the truth that was about to be revealed. As I stepped into the chapel's entrance, my breath caught. The heavy wooden doors seemed more than a physical barrier. They were a wall erected against my very dignity. Behind them, the body of the man who had walked beside me my entire life lay in state. And before them, I, a woman reduced to silence by her own children. They believed they could decide for me, that they had the right to silence my voice, to keep me from the final goodbye. But in that moment, something shifted within me. I was no longer the frail widow, no longer the aging mother they treated like a burden. I was Maggie Carter, and John still belonged to me in memory, in love, in promise. My hand trembled as I touched the letter in my coat pocket. The yellowed paper carried more than words. It carried the weight of years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights sewing so I'd never run out of medicine, of mornings when fresh coffee on the table meant hope for another day together. "It's up to you." The phrase echoed in my head like a hammer. John had entrusted me, and me alone, with the right to be there. It wasn't Ethan, nor Vanessa, nor the judgmental looks of the family laughing behind my back. It was me, and no one could take that away from me. I flung open the door, and for a moment the entire room turned. The murmur of those present dissolved into a heavy silence. I felt the weight of their gazes piercing my skin, some of disapproval, others of astonishment. Vanessa, sitting in the front row, raised her eyebrows as if to say, "I knew you'd make a scene." But what she didn't know was that I wasn't there to beg. I was there to demand. My feet moved forward on the red carpet, and each step seemed to carry the memory of all the paths I'd walked alongside John, the hospital corridors, the cold kitchen floor, the small streets of our town. When my voice finally came out, it wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a plea. It was firm, filled with everything they'd tried to extract from me. "No one can silence my goodbye." The sound cut through the air like a blade, and even the children stopped moving. Mr. Collins, the family lawyer, turned in surprise, and Pastor Hayes, who was already preparing to begin prayers, stopped mid. I pulled the letter from my pocket, holding it up as if holding indisputable proof. "He wrote it to me. He chose me. And this is where I'll be." There was a second of hesitation, the kind of silence that weighs like lead, until the pastor stepped forward. His eyes met mine, and I saw something in him I didn't see in anyone else there. Respect. He asked everyone to remain silent, and the room obeyed. It was as if the rules had suddenly changed, as if the power had shifted from the hands of those who tried to silence me and returned to where it had always been with me. Mr. Collins, in a grave voice, confirmed the authenticity of the letter. There was no denying it. From that moment on, what had previously been an attempt to exclude me became a public acknowledgement that I had a right to this place. They led me to the coffin, and my fingers, which had so often sewn together scraps to hold together a simple life, now closed over my husband's cold hand. The world around me disappeared. There were no sneers, no judgmental looks. Just the two of us, united by the promise no one could tear away. The letter burned in my pocket, but my heart burned even brighter. This wasn't just a farewell. It was my silent victory, proof that dignity isn't negotiable, that true love isn't extinguished by the decrees of ungrateful children. And as I stood there, holding John's hand, I could sense something bigger happening. It wasn't just about me. It was about all the invisible women, about every elderly woman whose voice was stolen, about every person silenced within their own family. I was there for myself, but also for them, and in that moment, I understood that this turning point wasn't just an act of courage, but a legacy I would leave for all who came after. The silence that filled the chapel was so dense it felt weighty. I could hear my own heartbeat, each pulse, reminding me that this was the moment that would change everything. I stood beside the casket, the letter still in my hands, and felt all eyes turning to me, waiting, judging, trying to decipher what was to come. That's when I lifted my gaze and let it rest on Ethan and Vanessa. They stood side by side, their expressions tense, as if finally realizing that the narrative they'd tried to construct was beginning to crumble in the face of the truth. I took a deep breath, and my voice came out clear, without a tremor, as if guided by something greater than myself. You laughed when you said I couldn't handle it. You believed you could silence me, that I would accept being excluded from the last moment of my husband's life. But today, what won't hold up is the lie. The impact was immediate. The air seemed to split in two, and the whispers that had previously circulated discreetly through the room were now replaced by an awkward silence. No one dared move. It was as if, suddenly, every person there had realized they had witnessed something unfair, and now there was no way to pretend they didn't know. I held the letter between my fingers, holding it up for all to see. Here is the truth, his voice, not the manipulated version they tried to force upon me, but the words John left for me. He wrote that it would be up to me to decide, that the farewell would only be meaningful if it were said with my hand holding his. My hands trembled, but it wasn't weakness. It was strength that overflowed in every gesture. Pastor Hayes approached, held out his hand, and asked me to read it aloud. I nodded, opening the paper, already yellowed with age. And then, in that expectant atmosphere, John's voice resurfaced through mine. Maggie, promise me you'll hold my hand during our final goodbyes. It's up to you. My words echoed through the chapel, piercing the walls, piercing the resistance of the gazes that had previously judged me. It was as if he were there, reminding everyone that love cannot be extinguished, negotiated, or manipulated. As I read, I felt the first tears well up. A woman in the community put her hand to her face. One of John's oldest friends bowed his head, clearly moved. And when I looked back at Ethan and Vanessa, I saw something in them I'd never seen before. Fear. The same mockery they'd carried for weeks was gone, and in its place was the certainty that their deception was exposed for all to see. It was as if each word in the letter was a blow that slowly dismantled the image of control they'd tried to maintain. Pastor Hayes raised his hand, calling for complete silence. Respect, he said, his voice firm and resounding like a command. And in that moment, it wasn't just my voice or his that was imposing itself. It was as if divine justice itself had descended upon the place, reminding everyone that there are limits to arrogance, and that, to play with another's grief, is to touch upon what is most sacred. Tears spread across the room. I saw previously indifferent faces turn sympathetic. What had begun as judgment now turned to compassion. Every look that met my eyes carried the weight of regret for not having stood up for myself sooner, for having believed the distorted versions circulating behind the scenes, and in that moment, I understood, this wasn't just about me. It was about exposing a hidden truth that so many preferred to ignore. When I folded the letter again, there was no turning back. The power had shifted. The impact wasn't just the revelation, but what it provoked within each person there. It was as if everyone had been forced to see what happens when you try to silence someone who carries dignity as a shield. And I, standing before everyone, knew that this wasn't the end yet. Because if the letter had brought the truth to light, there still remained the decision of what to do with it. And that choice, I was ready to make. After I folded John's letter and put it back in my pocket, I realized there was no need for anything else. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to defend myself with shouts or accusations. Silence had already become my greatest ally, and every glance in the room confirmed it. The weight of truth needs no fanfare. It bears its own weight. I was standing, and that was enough. From that moment on, I began making decisions without asking permission. When the pastor approached to determine the next steps, he asked me, not Ethan or Vanessa, and I responded calmly and firmly, as if finally reclaiming the space that had always belonged to me. I chose the songs, confirmed the burial location, and gave instructions on how I wanted the farewell to be conducted. My every word was greeted with respect, and even those who had previously looked at me with indifference now lowered their heads, as if understanding there was something greater at stake. There was no revenge made of scandals. It was a silent revenge, built on dignity, because there is nothing more devastating for someone who tries to belittle someone than seeing them rise even stronger, without needing to humiliate in return. Ethan and Vanessa remained in their seats, uncomfortable, restless, trying to avoid the stares that fell upon them. With each gesture of mine, they seemed to shrink a little more, as if finally having to face the consequences of their own choices. It was the law of return being fulfilled before everyone, not as a planned punishment, but as an inevitable reflection of life. I remember a lady who approached me at the end of the ceremony. She held my hand and said, her voice breaking, "You taught us all a lesson today." It wasn't about pride, nor about proving who was right. It was about showing that true love, sustained by years of sacrifice and respect, cannot be suffocated by selfish decisions. It was about making it clear that there are limits, and that when those limits are crossed, truth finds a way to assert itself. As I walked through the cemetery, led by friends who had always been by our side, I felt a strange peace. It wasn't the end of my pain, because John's absence still burned within me, but it was the beginning of a new mindset. I was no longer trapped in the narrative of fragility they tried to impose on me. I was, once again, in control of my journey. I had taken back what had been denied me, the right to decide, to say goodbye, to exist with dignity. At the wake, when I thanked the community, I didn't need long speeches. I simply looked each person in the eye and said, "Thank you for respecting my farewell." That was enough for everyone to understand. The respect I had been denied earlier that day now returned, multiplied, and those who tried to silence me emerged smaller, not because I had diminished them, but because they had revealed, on their own, who they truly were. This is true transformation, not allowing pain to make us bitter, but using that same pain to build invisible boundaries, lines no one will ever cross without noticing the impact. John's letter wasn't just a request, it was a revelation that changed everything. It was as if he had anticipated this moment, as if he knew I would need an anchor to keep me from getting lost in the storm, and he gave it to me. I followed each decision with serenity, knowing it wasn't just a goodbye, it was a turning point. I didn't just want to bury my husband. I also wanted to bury the distorted image they'd created of me. No longer the fragile, submissive, dependent woman. I was now the portrait of silent resistance, of power that doesn't shout, but asserts itself in a non-negotiable way. When it was all over, I didn't return home the same way I left. I entered that chapel alone, feeling diminished by the weight of injustice. I left there standing tall, carrying not only John's memory, but also the certainty that life presents us with trials that reveal who we truly are. And if my children tried to bury me along with the dignity they had stripped from me, they left defeated before the eyes of the community, because everyone reaps what they sow. And that day, they reaped the bitter fruit of arrogance, while I reaped the unexpected strength of silent justice. And perhaps that was the greatest impact of all, realizing that the most powerful revenge lies not in the noise of confrontation, but in the silence that reveals the truth. And it was in that silence, laden with meaning, that I realized the journey wasn't over yet. There was something greater to come, something looming on the horizon of that farewell. As if each step I took led me to an even deeper revelation. As the afternoon drew to a close, and the silence of the cemetery became almost absolute, I felt that moment belonged not just to John and me, but to everyone there. It was as if every tear, every heavy look, every pent-up breath had revealed a hidden truth that many avoided facing. You don't rob someone of the right to say goodbye. You don't erase the presence of someone who has built a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and loyalty. What they tried to take from me became something much greater, living example that dignity is non-negotiable, no matter who tries to diminish it. I looked around and saw people wiping their eyes, some unable to hide the impact John's words had when read aloud. It wasn't just a letter, it was a revelation, an intimate glimpse into our journey that was now made public, like a beacon illuminating the true meaning of respect. What began as humiliation was becoming a lesson. And this transformation didn't happen by chance. It was the result of the decision not to remain silent, not to allow others to decide for me what was rightfully mine. Within me, a mixture of grief and serenity intertwined. The pain of loss remained, but something new was growing there. The certainty that even in suffering, it is possible to find unexpected strength. It is at this point in the journey that many lose their way, letting the weight of injustice crush them. But my mindset transformed when I understood that true revenge lies not in anger, but in the silent steadfastness of those who remain standing. With every gesture I made that day, I demonstrated that this was not just a wake, but a revelation about what it means to love until the end and be respected for it. John was no longer there physically, but I felt his presence in every detail, in the cold wind that blew through the chapel, in the sound of the voices that died away when the letter was read, even in the uneasiness of Ethan and Vanessa, who could no longer sustain their lie in front of so many. The law of return was being fulfilled before everyone's eyes. They reaped the contempt they sowed, while I, silently, reaped strength I never imagined I possessed. This role reversal needed no audience, but it happened before one, a cruel reminder that truth always finds a way. Looking at the closed casket, I remembered so many nights I sewed in silence to sustain the house. Every morning John told me my coffee was the best in the world. Every decision we made together, simply but always with respect. This emotional memory came like an invisible thread, connecting the past to the present and showing me that, even without him by my side, I could still honor his voice, his desire, his trust in me. The letter was just a piece of paper, but it carried a weight greater than any notarized document. It was the truth of our story. It was then that I felt the need to look up and face not only those present, but also everyone who would, in some way, hear this story. It wasn't just about Maggie Carter, nor just about John. It was about all the silenced voices, about every goodbye denied, about every invisible person left out of what mattered most. The lesson was there, so clear it hurt. No one has the right to silence someone's goodbye. My voice came out firm, slow, charged with the power of everything that had happened up to that moment. Whoever keeps silent about a farewell will never be forgiven. The silence that followed was even heavier than all the previous ones, because now it wasn't just my heart speaking, it was the collective consciousness of each person there, marked by the certainty that they had witnessed something impossible to forget. And as I held my gaze steady, I felt there was one last thing to say, not as a request, but as a sincere invitation, so that this story wouldn't be lost, so that it would reach those who needed to hear it. I took a deep breath and said, if this story touched you, write dignity until the end in the comments, and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because only together can we echo what should never be silenced. And I let my words linger in the air, not as a full stop, but as a bridge, knowing there was still more to be told, more to be revealed. And if you've made it this far with me, I truly need to thank you. This wasn't just the story of my farewell, but a conversation about respect, dignity, and the choices that define us. If at any point you felt this message spoke to you, leave a comment below. This message was for me. It's the most beautiful way for me to know my voice resonated with you. Your presence makes all the difference. Each subscription to the channel is a sign that it's worth continuing to bring you stories that move, provoke, and make us rethink the way we live. If you haven't subscribed yet, take advantage now and join me on this journey. And, of course, if this video touched you in any way, please leave a like, not as a simple gesture, but as part of the connection we've built along the way. And if you want to continue with me, there's a video right here that complements this topic. Click and follow along, because the conversation doesn't end here.